have with us Gilles Boquerat. He is a scholar and an expert on Indian subcontinent, its security and strategic affairs. He is an author of several books and his latest is on India. In fact, his book is called 100 Questions on India. And I think that is precisely the reason for us to be talking to him today here in Paris. Welcome to Reason, the New Indians platform, where we get to the reason behind the issues that concern you. Welcome, Mr. Boquerat.
Good morning.
Good morning. So let me begin this conversation with the area of specialization that you have. You have worked both in Islamabad and New Delhi for several years, and you've been focusing on Indian subcontinent security and strategic affairs. Tell us today in 2023, where do you see and how do you see the security dynamics of India vis-a-vis its neighbors, Pakistan, we have China also. What is the sense of security and strategy about Indian subcontinent today?
Yes, as you know, I would like to say also that I am an historian by training. So I did a PhD from Sorbonne University, but my fieldwork was at the time at Jawaharlal Nehru University.
Jawaharlal Nehru University, yes. Yes. Which years were there?
Oh, it was towards the end of the 80s. That's quite a long time ago now.
Yes. And you studied at GNU?
I did my fieldwork for my PhD. I was based on GNU campus, in fact, in Brahmaputra Hostel. And I spent 2.5 years on, working on going to Nehru Memorial Library, which has been renamed recently, I heard.
Do you think that it is a serious possibility that India could be facing a two-front war, both from Pakistan and China? Like China, Pakistan today, we know, have also established an axis. There is a stronger relationship between Pakistan and China today, as we are seeing that the world is divided between the US bloc and the Chinese bloc?
About this two-front war, yes, in fact, I do think that there's not a risk in the near future. But now, what I can notice that seen from India, the main enemy is no more Pakistan, it's China, especially after the episode of 2020, of course, in the military confrontation in the Ladakh sector. That's a big chance. Interest, strategic interest or threat for India is no more coming so often from Pakistan as it was in the past. Now what is on the front page of India's strategic consideration is, of course, more China than Pakistan.
So do you think that when a lot of people say that there is still two-front, 2.5-front, even 3-front war for India, but you believe really that it's one front and that front is China. Now, tell us, in the scenario where India is also emerging as one of the largest economies, the 5th largest economy, and China being a superpower, giving enough competition to not just the US but the entire West, do you foresee India and Chinese relationship deteriorating? Perhaps, we do have a standoff along the line of actual control with China, but do you see a breakdown of relationship between India and China?
Just one word coming back to the India-Pakistan relations. The balances of power between the two is completely different from what it was in the past. If you see at the economic situation in Pakistan, which is terrible in fact, and you had recently the agreement with the IMF for a loan from the IMF to Pakistan. Again, if you look at the balance of power between India and Pakistan, which is very much in favor of India, it's moving more and more in favor of India. There was a time when GDP per capita in Pakistan was higher than in India. Now it's completely the reverse. Coming to the relation between India and China, again, it's different. The balance of power is much in favor of China because in terms of GDP, it's 4 times the GDP of India. So that's a reason also, of course, because to the fact that India is improving his relations with Washington, trying to, on both sides, they have their own interests. Washington want to use India as a counterweight somehow to China footprint in the Asian continent, even beyond that. And India has its own interest, of course, in moving closer to Washington, because as you have noticed during the visit of Mr. Modi to Washington, there was some number of agreements on defense, of course, between the two countries.
So, a lot of countries, even in Europe, we see on one hand there is a review of thinking in the Western Bloc that China needs to be curtailed, to be contained. But at the same time, nobody has really stopped trading with China. Nobody is antagonizing China. In fact, we did see a lot of friendly overtures from European leaders, Olaf Scholz. We also saw Biden administration, which was initially very aggressive against China, has now made a U-turn, and they are reaching out to Xi Jinping in China. What is really, what do you foresee the impact of this friendly overtures towards China? What would be the impact on Indian subcontinent?
But the fact that you cannot just dismiss China because in economic terms, you were mentioning India. Of course, India imports from China 6 times more than India exports to China. It's not imbalance between China and the USA, of course, but the place of China in the international economic system is so large now that you cannot do without China, and it will take time to cut the link of parts of the links that you have between China and the Western world, of course. That's the reason why you have the Quad, trying to have cooperation between those 4 countries, trying to be resilient somehow, and not so much dependent on China for economic considerations. Of course, you cannot do with China, and that's why also Mr. Biden is trying to make bridges with China somehow. Now the big question, of course, is Taiwan.
Yes, but even on Taiwan, now the US administration is saying that they believe in one China policy. They do not see Taiwan as a separate independent country. In that scenario, what would be the impact on India if there is so much cooperation between China and the West? Do you think it will embolden China against India, or do you foresee something else?
Regarding Taiwan, you talk about the one China policy, which is a policy of most of the countries in the world, in fact, even the USA and even, of course, India, which I recognize the one China policy. Now, what would happen is somehow in the near future, in the next 5 to 10 or 15 years, China, that's a promise of Mr. Xi Jinping, by the way, to reunite Taiwan with mainland China. What would be the reaction of the Western world? What would be the reaction of India? I don't think that India will engage militarily with China.
Do you think NATO will engage with China militarily?
There's a big question marks that nobody really knows what could happen if tomorrow Mr. Xi Jinping wants to invade Taiwan. The pressure might be more on economic tension vis-à-vis China. Military intervention would be extremely difficult.
So there will be economic sanctions like the sanctions imposed on Russia during the Ukraine war.
Yeah, but China is so much dependent on the trade business with all of the world, in fact.
So wouldn't that be counterproductive for the West as well to even think of economic sanctions against China, because their economy of Europe and economy of the US and the entire Western world is also linked with the Chinese economy?
Yes, but talking about the USA has a military number of military agreement with Southeast Asian nations, for instance. That's the credibility of Washington, which would be at stake in case of invasion of Taiwan. The USA will have to do something. And that's what is on the radar of Washington now. It's not so much the war in Ukraine, which is important, of course, because most Western nations are still dependent on US military support. And of course, first of all, Ukraine itself. Again, the question is what the USA will do because if they don't want to lose credibility vis-à-vis all these or Japan, even talking about Japan, which is a very large country, of course, all these smaller Southeast Asian nations. Australia also is in the picture, coming into the picture.
Okay.
So again, one can just hope that nothing will happen too soon.
You're talking about Taiwan, but don't you think that in the last few years it is demonstrated sufficiently that China has been more aggressive against India? We have had Galwan Valley crisis, we have had Doklam crisis, we have a continuing standoff, and there has been no resolution so far between India and China on the territorial disputes that they have.
Yeah, of course, but this tense relation with China go back to post-independence period, in a sense. There was this rivalry between India and China way back in the 50s, or who would be the leader of the third world, which is now the global south. And of course, there was this 1962 war with China, which was quite a humiliating experience for India. I can understand that. So the relation between India and China has always been kind of competition to who would be represented first, especially during the Maoist period even, which economic model would be taken as again as a model for all the third world countries at the time. So this kind of competition between Beijing and New Delhi will go on definitely.
It will increase. Do you see an escalation?
I don't know if it will. No, I don't think it will increase. But again, it seems that it look all these skirmishes on the border between India and China chronologically. It happened very often when you have steps taken in favor of further closeness between India and Washington.
As India becomes closer and closer with the West, that is primarily led by the US, China and India relationship will become worse.
Yes, definitely. It would be surprising if it's not. It goes another way. You'll have the BRICS meeting coming very soon in August. Let's see what if it takes place visually, in a sense, not through Skype or WhatsApp or whatever it is. If there's a meeting between Mr. Xi Jinping and Mr. Modi, and one wonder if Mr. Putin will come in person at the meeting in South Africa.
So suppose BRICS meeting does happen physically. Do you foresee some tension erupting between India and the US or the West?
No, but again, the problem with BRICS, it's the imbalance between the country within the BRICS.
Yeah.
The leading power is China again, and I don't think that India is very happy with that, being kind of somehow minor position vis-à-vis China. I don't see BRICS going very far, in fact.
You don't foresee BRICS going very far?
Yes.
But there are a lot of countries...
I mean, talking about the near future, I don't know if I cannot foresee in 20 years.
Countries are now, in fact, expressing interest in joining BRICS. We know some of the Middle East countries, some of the Latin American countries are showing interest, and they are hoping that BRICS actually expands and becomes perhaps a bigger bloc against the Western bloc.
But I don't know, many countries which would like to join the BRICS don't want at the same time to organize the West, the Western world. You have to consider that, in fact. And the problem with BRICS is that you have China as a major power, and you have a kind of imbalance that you have in a limited way, of course, within SAARC. SAARC is not working because you have India is the major power within SAARC, representing 3/4 of the SAARC countries, in fact, in terms of economic power, military power, population, and so on and so forth.
Well, you said Pakistan is no longer really a threat or a front for India. But we do know that even as Pakistan has weakened economically, and now the gap between India and Pakistan is massive. But Pakistan's foreign policy vis-a-vis India hasn't changed. We continue to see cross-border terrorism. We continue to see infiltration. We also continue to see China-Pakistan partnership, especially with regards to cross-border terrorism. We know that China actually blocked several moves at the United Nations to designate Pakistan-based terror organizations as terror organizations, and also some of the key leaders of terror groups. So why would you say that Pakistan is not a threat?
No, Pakistan has the capacity to create trouble for India. There's no doubt about that through infiltrations, for instance, of course. Again, I was thinking it's not a threat in a major confrontation with India because in conventional terms, militarily, India is much stronger now than Pakistan. India can face a Pakistani threat, of course. Again, that doesn't say there's no risk of a terrorist attack on Indian soil. It can always happen, of course, as we have seen, unfortunately, in the past. Okay. So I will not dismiss completely Pakistan's threat. I mean,
but do you see this Pakistan and China axis becoming a bigger trouble for India?
But again, China would not like antagonize so much India because even for China, India is a market.
Okay.
You can sell goods to India, as I mentioned earlier, the imbalanced commercial trade between the countries is heavily imbalanced in favor of China. China, again, I was talking about Pakistan able to create trouble for India. It could always be the same on the border, the common border between India and China. You can have skirmishes from time to time, but I don't see it escalating in the major war between the two countries.
But do you think Pakistan is now distancing itself from the US, which was its biggest ally for more than 70 years?
No, there's no doubt that the major ally of Pakistan is the all-weather friendly relation with Pakistan, of course. Sorry, with China. That's clear. Again, Washington cannot completely forget Pakistan in a sense, because as Pakistan, there's always a risk in Pakistan, and Washington, I'm sure, needs Pakistan to oversee the situation in Afghanistan, which is across the border from Pakistan. There's always a terror risk. Spending from Afghanistan to Pakistan and otherwise in the other countries.
So do you see Pakistan establishment and Taliban establishment in Afghanistan getting closer, or do you see them drifting away from each other?
And Pakistan is also under threat from the TTP now, for Taliban Pakistan. They have even trouble in controlling the support that Kabul could give to the TTP to conduct actions across the border in Pakistan trouble areas. If you look at the 90s, it's well known that Pakistan was using elements which were trained in Afghanistan to conduct operations across the border in India. The risk is always there, of course.
So there is a risk of their alliance still being a major threat to India, like Taliban and ISI?
There is always this possibility, but the situation in Pakistan at the moment is so financially difficult that Pakistan cannot risk to open a new front. I guess Pakistan has some trouble solving their financial situation at the moment, and I'm sure that they cannot antagonize the IMF, for instance, and behind the IMF you have Washington. So to open a new front and to resurrect the kind of support they were giving to infiltration across the border in Kashmir in the 90s, it's not the priority of the moment for the Pakistani establishment, it's my guess.
Very interestingly, Europe has, in the last few years, been talking about Indo-Pacific security. Now, India earlier was focused only on Indian Ocean. India is also talking about Indo-Pacific. How is France, why is France invested in this Indo-Pacific security, and where do you see areas of collaboration between India and Europe and the US also? We know Quad is a certain framework, but it hasn't really done anything. It hasn't come to any outcome so far. Where are the areas of collaboration and cooperation on Indo-Pacific, and why is the security of both these oceans now seen as a joint security framework?
One has to say, first of all, that France considers itself as a resident power of the Indo-Pacific because we have French territories in Polynesia, in New Caledonia, and we have also in the Indian Ocean the Reunion Island. In that sense, France has decided, that was in 2018 when President Macron went to Delhi, they signed Indo-French strategic vision for the Indo-Pacific to make sure that freedom of navigation remain in the Indo-Pacific region. Of course, there was, especially from the Indian side, the Chinese footprint in the Indian Ocean, which is a matter of huge concern for India. Of course, I can understand that. So France has decided, given the geographical location of India, that they could rely on India to develop a strong strategic cooperation with this whole Indo-Pacific region. I would just like to recall that the first maritime exercises, joint exercises between the French and Indian Navy happened way back in '83. Now it's a yearly occurrence. At the same time, you also exercises since the last 20 years between the air forces of France and India, and also the land forces of France and India, Shakti exercises and Garuda exercises between French and Indian air forces. So we have developed tight joint military cooperation for the last 20 years. The benchmark, in fact, was 98. As you know, we are celebrating the 25th anniversary of Indo-French strategic partnership, which, by the way, was the first strategic partnership signed with India with a foreign country. France and India relation between the two countries have never been so good. I would just recall one thing, being an historian by training, that the first French president to come to India was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and it was in January 1980. Okay. So that means 33 years after the independence of India. India was not much in the horizon of French strategies for many decades after Second World War, for some good reason, because somehow India was not part of the French heritage, colonial heritage, I mean. apart from
Well,
this
we
more
had-
establishment,
We had
Pondicherry.
big
Yes.
French colony in Pondicherry.
You had 5 French establishments,
Yes.
Caracal, Pondicherry, Mahé,
Yes.
Yano, and Chandranagar, of course. But that was very small, limited area. And there was also the impression that India was part of the Anglo-Saxon world. And also, of course, during the Cold War, France was part of the Western Alliance. And India was non-aligned and slowly moving closer to the Soviet Union at the time. So there was this distance between, for all these reasons, between France and India. And again, what made a good difference, that was this, again, 1998 strategic cooperation, which was followed by the nuclear test of India in May 98, and the response of France was quite mild compared to other Western countries which strongly condemned the test by India for our own good reason, because of our nuclear policy, independent nuclear policy.
Yeah, in fact, in France is perhaps one of the few countries who's been supporting India's bid for a permanent seat at the UNSC. So that is also demonstrates the strength of the relationship. And in fact, let me now come back to your experience of India. And also, you've seen India since the 80s, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. From 80s till 2023, you've been an avid observer and a scholar on India. What is your sense? What has changed in India in the last 40 years?
It's somehow a different country, I would say. I'm quite surprised by the development of India now especially for the last 10 to 20 years. It's moving fast, it's developing very fast now. So it's a reason also why there's so much attraction for India now in France, and not just in France. There are so much countries who are in India for basic economic relation, because India become a market now you cannot ignore, of course. What I see, having lived in India since you mentioned the end of the 80s, India's Delhi, had changed quite a lot. Spending very largely towards all these suburb of Delhi, Gurugram, and so on and so forth. Noida, for instance. I remember a time when my first visit to India was in 80, and I was staying with some Indian friends, I would say. It was in Greater Karachi, part 1, and it was close to Nehru Place, and at the time, Nehru Place was the southern limit of New Delhi. The idea was beyond that, it was a jungle. It was called the jungle.
Yes.
So now it's not really a jungle anymore.
Since you've seen different prime ministers, you've seen different governments in Delhi, I think the significant turning point for India was when India opened up economic liberalization, made a major shift in India's foreign policy as well as economic policy. And do you see any change between, let's say, the current government's foreign policy and economic policy and the preceding governments?
In fact, we're talking about foreign policy, as you know, it's the same for almost every country. There's no abrupt turn, I would say. There is a sense of continuity in terms of policy. It's valid for any country, more or less. The turn, as you mentioned, was 91, the end of the Cold War, and when non-alignment as such was not making sense, because it was defined in relation with Cold War confrontation between the East and the West, between Soviet Union and the Western world. Now, there is a sense of continuity from the 90s. Of course, the situation in India was difficult economically in the 90s. But if you look at what happened for the last 20 to 25 years, there again a sense of continuity from the policy which was followed from, I remember the turn somehow for the relation with the USA was visit of Clinton in March 2000 in New Delhi. So I would say that the big change, of course, is the relation between India and Washington, of course. Okay. That's a major change for India because there was this kind of closeness during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. But one major aspect of the relation between India and the USA I would like to mention, that the importance of Indian diaspora in the US.
Okay.
As you may know, yes, you have a CEO of Google, of so many, Microsoft too. Mm-hmm. The new...
we even had Parag Agarwal heading Twitter at one point. We had...
You have Ajay Banga, who is heading the World Bank. So many of them. Yeah. Sundar Pichai, so many of them. So that's make a difference because you always has a link in terms of family connection of going to the USA to conduct your higher studies, higher education. So one should keep in mind the importance of Indian diaspora, which is well-off diaspora in the USA, and how it matters in the relation between New Delhi and Washington nowadays. Mm-hmm.
Where do you see France and India going together as strategic partners in future?
No, again, France also always had independent foreign policy. As President Mitterrand used to say that France is an ally of the USA, but not aligned with the USA.
That's very critical, yes.
We try to maintain an independent foreign policy, of course, in that sense that it's the same for India, of course. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mention of autonomy, we have to maintain. I mean, India has to maintain its autonomy strategy. So it's almost the same in France. And France has considered for the last 20-25 years that India is an emerging power, and the one you can rely on to conduct worldwide policy. And France, as I mentioned correctly, of course, France has always supported the possibility of the necessity, in fact, of India becoming a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations.
And do you see Emmanuel Macron, President Macron, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi sharing the same kind of rapport that Prime Minister Modi shared with François Hollande? Or is it evolving into a much stronger relationship now?
I think the relation between President Macron and Prime Minister Modi is better than it was before. In fact, it seems that, as from what you can read in the press, that they are in changing taste on WhatsApp or anywhere. I don't know, but the relation between the two men are quite close.
And what could be the reason for that? Is it only foreign policy or is it something bigger than that?
I'm not in a secret of the relation between Mr. Modi and President Macron at the personal level. Mm-hmm. So I cannot say about that. But again, France has bet on its relation of India as very important aspect of this overall foreign policy of France.
Is it because India has a massive market, or is there like a review of thinking that maybe the supply chains need to move away from China and India could be an alternative?
India could be an alternative. Of course, we don't have the same kind of interest as some US company, as Apple, of course, could have in trying to repatriate these factories from China to India. But again, there is many strategic convergences between India and France. Mm-hmm. You have, of course, to be more prosaic, You have economic interest because India is a huge market now. Again, 6.5 economic growth this year, it seems. There's a policy on making a business with India on commercial term, on investment in India. I guess now you have 600 to 700 French company having subsidiaries on Indian soil. That matter again, and France has one thing which was quite interesting. I noticed that for a long time regarding Réunion Island, French territory in the Indian Ocean, for a long time India was considering Réunion Island as a leftover of the French colonial empire. It seems that now some ships of the Indian Navy can even dock in the Réunion Island. That's quite a change from the perception that France can have of India, as I was mentioning before, and kind of perception India as of France now.